Alhamdulillah, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين ختم الأنبياء ورحمة للعالمين سيدنا وحبيبنا وشفيئنا ومولانا محمد وآله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. My dear respected brothers and sisters in Islam and brothers and sisters in humanity, welcome to the next of our episodes, which are looking at these difficult times when we find ourselves under lockdown, and how we are going to try, inshallah, to make a connection between our worship and our character. We know, of course, from the very first episode why we are doing this, because we mentioned the hadith, which roughly translates as Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam saying, "I have not been sent except to perfect good character." So we're trying to look at these episodes as how we can best build our character by focusing on how our worship connects to our character. In the previous episode, we looked at Ramadan. And we looked at the Ramadan and its multitude of benefits, and specifically we looked how it can build our character in general. In this episode, inshallah, with you today, I would like, inshallah, if Allah gives us tawfiq, to look at how two particular aspects of character can be really built upon with the blessed month of Ramadan, and specifically the fasting of the month of Ramadan. How we can really focus in and build two elements of our character, which are absolutely fundamental elements of our character, if, inshallah, we are to be successful in our dunya and our akhirah, most importantly. The first of these will come as no surprise to anyone who has fasted before, is patience, Sabr. I want to look, if I might, for the next few minutes at the connection between fasting and building Sabr, building patience. Before we look at how the fasting connects to building patience, if we might for a moment maybe just look at the subject of patience in generality, just so we remind ourselves, myself before anyone else, of the importance of patience and the benefits of patience. We all hear the word patience many, many times. Whenever anybody feels a sense of difficulty, our brothers and sisters will rally around and tell us to be patient, to have sabr. So we need to first understand why this is so important, and then we will look at how we build it through our fasting, inshallah. So let's begin with why it is so important. In terms of its importance, Imam Ahmad, may Allah be pleased with him, mentioned that the issue of sabr, of patience, was mentioned in the Quran in over 90 places. Over 90 places in the Quran, Allah has mentioned sabr, or patience. Straight away, that makes us recognize something. It must be important. When Allah has mentioned subjects, issues, many, many times, it's because it has the relevant importance that it warrants being mentioned many times. So we straight away recognize Allah has mentioned this over 90 times in His book. Therefore, it must be something we need to take note of. It must be something that we need to pay close attention to. On top of that, many of us may be familiar with the saying of Ali radiyallahu anhu, in which he said that the likeness of patience to Iman is like the head to the body. If the head falls, if the head is cut off, then the body becomes useless, or the body falls. And then he raises his voice and he says, there is no patience without Iman. There is no Iman without patience. There is no Iman without patience. There is no Iman without patience is mentioned towards the end of that narration. He then went on to say that patience is like a ride, a beast that you ride, a horse or an animal, a camel, a ride that keeps on going without tiring. The likeness of patience to Iman is like the head to the body. Just pause for a second. The likeness of the head to the body. He goes on to explain it for us, but even you and I can straight away understand. Without your head, what is your body? Nothing. Useless. If it's cut off, essentially you die. Which is why he went on to say that if it falls, if it's cut, then the body is useless, or it falls. So we need to recognize straight away, patience is a big deal. We need to have this patience. We need to develop this patience. We need to consider in all of our actions, are we being patient? And perhaps at this time of lockdown, this is one of the ingredients, one of the characteristics, one of the manners that we probably need to work on most, because it is a difficult time. People are finding themselves in situations they haven't been in before. People are confined in closed spaces, some people very close spaces, in situations with people they haven't spent that long time before, and maybe people are getting on each other's nerves. Instead, it's an opportunity to develop patience. People are having to be patient when they're going out shopping and they're seeing shortages or alleged shortages, and people are going crazy buying stuff. We need to be patient. As Muslims, we don't join in. Rather, we be patient. And if there's a queue half a mile long, we patiently queue. So there are many aspects just of the lockdown that will help us build patience. But as I say, I wanted to focus today on how we use our fasting in Ramadan, which will be coming up, inshallah, in about 3 weeks' time, 2.5 weeks' time. I know, look at the calendar. I don't have a calendar in front of me. And we want to focus on how we can use our fasting in Ramadan to build our patience. We've seen it's important. Great. How do we use Ramadan to build it? First, let's recognize that it is a month where we can really utilize to build our patience. In a hadith found in Tirmidhi, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam said, roughly translated, in a hadith found in the Musnad of Imam Ahmed, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam said, roughly translated, the month of patience and 3 days of every month are times of fasting. Imam Tirmidhi commented on this hadith, saying what he alayhi salatu wasalam was referring to by the month of patience is, of course, the month of Ramadan. The month of patience. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned specifically the month of patience. Why? We all know, those of us who have fasted, it does require patience. It does require patience. It requires patience for us to fast. Now, if we think about another advice of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam when it comes to building restraint, building patience, which is one we're all familiar with, a hadith found in Bukhari and Muslim, when he said, roughly translated, O youths, whoever amongst you is able to marry, then let him do so, for it restrains the eyes and protects the private parts. Marriage restrains the eyes and protects the private parts. But whoever is unable to, then let him fast, because it is a shield for him. Rasulullah ﷺ mentioning to us here in this narration that fasting is like a shield for us. In the first instance, he said marriage protects the eyes and the private parts. So if you can marry, then marry. But if you're unable to, then the shield that you should adopt is fasting, because it helps us develop restraint, because it helps us develop patience, so we don't stray, inshallah, with the eyes or the private parts as well, and all other forms of straying. So straight away we realize that fasting helps us to build this restraint. Fasting helps us to build this patience. We look at what we understand from patience and its various manifestations. And many of our ulama have mentioned that there are 3 essential types of patience that we should think about when we're trying to develop patience in ourselves. The first one is patience with the obedience to Allah. The second one is patience with not disobeying Allah, making sure we're not in the disobedience of Allah. And the third type of patience is patience with the qadr of Allah, with what Allah has decreed for us. We may look in a moment or two at how sometimes these have different manifestations for us. I just want to look at the last one first, if I might. Patience with the qadr of Allah. Many of us might find ourselves in times of difficulty, inadvertently perhaps, making statements which aren't befitting to accepting that it is the qadr of Allah that is happening in front of us. Even now with COVID-19, with coronavirus, there are Muslims making statements. Why has Allah done this? How could it happen? And lamenting and tearing their hair out and all of those things. That is not patience with the qadr of Allah. Of course, we must take whatever precautions we need to take. We must tie our camels to the best of our abilities. We must adopt whatever the health experts are giving us as advice in order to be as safe as we possibly can, inshallah, in these times. But we shouldn't do so in a way that is despairing, that is questioning, how could Allah do this? Many people will have experienced at one of the most difficult times of people's lives, which is the loss of a loved one. And of course, many of our brothers and sisters are losing loved ones now during this COVID-19 time. Some people at these times will utter statements, and of course it's one of the hardest times that anybody can ever face, is to lose a loved one. But that's why it's so important at those moments to remember how important it is to have patience. Sometimes we hear people say, of course, crying out to Allah, why did you take him from me? Why did you take her from me? I remember sitting in a gathering when a very young man had passed away at the age of 17 or 18. And even the practicing, in inverted commas, people were uttering statements along the lines of he had his whole life ahead of him, he had planned to go to university, he had planned to go and study, all of that was ripped away from him. How could this happen? Why would anyone do this to him? Why did this happen? All of these types of statements. It's times like that we have to remember life and death are in Allah's hands. As I say, we take whatever precautions we can. Don't jump off a building and say it's in Allah's hands if I live or die. But we recognize, after taking precautions, life and death in Allah's hands. Did he have his whole life ahead of him? That was the moment that Allah had chosen to take him. That was the moment on the 120th day when the ruh was blown into the fetus in his mother's womb, that the time of his death was written, inscribed. So at that moment, it was known, and it was already known 50,000 years before the creation in Allah al-Mahfuz, that would be the moment of death. So did he have his whole life ahead of him? No. Of course, we are just saying these are statements of statements of sorrow and sadness. But sometimes we need to be careful with the statements we make. Sometimes we need to be careful with the way that our statements may, inadvertently, of course, I recognize, and we would all recognize, these are inadvertently statements that may be contradictory to acceptance of the qadr of Allah. Sadness and sorrow are absolutely normal at times of difficulty. Tears flowing at times of death are absolutely normal at times of difficulty. But we need to remind ourselves to be careful with the words and the actions that we may manifest, so that we're not falling into a category whereby perhaps we are questioning, or worse still, more than questioning, complaining about the qadr of Allah that he has written for us. So the third type of patience that I wanted to mention first is patience with acceptance of the qadr of Allah. I mentioned the other two types of patience are patience with the obedience to Allah and patience with not disobeying Allah. Now let's get back to how we connect this to Ramadan. We just mentioned the hadith in which Rasulullah gave us an advice that marriage, of course, is a protection for the private parts and for the eyes. But those who are unable to marry should fast because it is a restraint. That word restraint and patience, if we fasted before we recognize these are what are required in order to get through the fast, because we are restraining ourselves from eating and drinking and marital relations. We're having to restrain ourselves from very early hours till the sunset. A long day, particularly those in the northern hemisphere, are having very long days in the summer for fasting. So this abstention from the things that we take for granted on our daily lives, eating and drinking, marital relations, the things that we need on a daily basis to feed our bodies and our heart and our desires. We feed our bodies and our desires with these issues of food and drink and marital relations. When we're fasting, we have to restrain from them. We have to be patient to obey Allah and make sure we fast. We have to be patient in not disobeying Allah by breaking the fast when we're not meant to. Let's just pause for a second and see how we develop that patience in that sense. We very famously know that fasting is for Allah. It is clearly mentioned that fasting is for Allah. Hadith Qudsi, that fasting is for Allah. It is for Him. We can prove to ourselves whether or not we are fasting for Allah or not. If we're alone and no one's going to see us, if we're alone and we hid away in a room, in a cupboard, if you can fit in a cupboard, and ate a sandwich, and your parents wouldn't see, your wife wouldn't see, your husband wouldn't see, your kids wouldn't see, whoever wouldn't see, you could get away with it. But you knew that Allah was watching, so you and I, inshallah, didn't do it. This requires a patience, because we could do it without being caught by human beings. And it reminds us of who we're fasting for. We said in our first episode, when we talked about fasting, that we fast only for Allah. We fast only for Allah. And therefore we have to have patience in making sure we adhere to the regulations of fasting. We abstain from the food, we abstain from the drink, even though it's right in front of us, even though there's a fridge, even though there's a cupboard, even though there's a tap, and all of these things. But we restrain ourselves, we patiently restrain ourselves. Until when? Until the time that Allah has ordained that it is now permissible to again eat and drink. The iftar, the sunset. This requires patience. When the head is thumping with headache, when the days are hot and long, when, if you live in a society where not everybody is fasting, in non-Muslim societies, the majority of people around us will not be fasting. Perhaps this year may be different if we're still in lockdown during Ramadan, but even still the majority of society will not be fasting. It requires patience. It requires sabr to make sure that we stick to what we are meant to do. Now, in building that patience, in building that ability to restrain from food and drink, from the physical needs and the physical desires. I say physical needs and physical desires because when it comes to particularly food and drink, many people, myself before anyone, maybe we don't just take what we need, maybe we take what we desire. We often find ourselves looking towards food and meals and dinners as a form of pleasure, as opposed to need. We will come, when we look at our second trait connected to character and fasting in a few minutes, as to how that may not be the case for everyone. And we will focus in on that temporarily in about 5 minutes' time. But going back to this issue of building our patience, we then recognize that building this restraint, building this patience by abstention, refraining, helps us not just to build patience in this aspect. Ramadan is a time where we can develop training for the rest of the year. If we can build that patience for 1 month by abstaining from food, by abstaining from drink during those daylight hours, from marital relations, we have the ability then to maintain that restraint, that patience for many months to come afterwards. And of course, if we regularly practice fasting, this is something that we can develop throughout the year. Before I go on to the second trait that I want to talk about in terms of building character when we're fasting, I just want to pause on patience for a second to make another connection. We mentioned that when we are fasting, we are abstaining from food and drink and physical relations during the daylight hours. And these are, of course, the physical needs and the physical desires of the body. There are two parts to the human being, however. There is the body, which has its desires as well, the nafs. But there's also the ruh, the soul. Now, I just want to remind myself that Ramadan has been mentioned as Ramadan is the month of the Quran. Very familiar to us. Ramadan is the month of Quran. The Quran was revealed in Ramadan. The Quran is being recited in abundance in Ramadan. Many of us will in Ramadan probably recite and contemplate and reflect on the Quran maybe more than we do for the rest of the year. Many people will be completing recitation as well as reflection on the Quran in the month of Ramadan. So Ramadan is the month of the Quran. In normal years, when we have the ability to go and pray Taraweeh, we will be hearing and absorbing the beautiful recitation of the full Quran, if we are able to do so by attending Taraweeh. Again, we don't know if that will be something available to us this year, depending on which country you're in and what situation we find ourselves in. But there's an interesting analogy there. The body and the nafs requires the food and the drink because it is made from the earth, from the clay. And the food and the drink are earthly substances from the earth. Therefore, the earthly substance feeds the earthly part of the body. The human being is made up, as I say, of two parts. The earthly part, the clay that has made us originally, and the ruh, which is from Allah. Remember that the ruh, according to Allah in the Quran, is from Him, very much from Him. So if the ruh is from Him, its food is slightly different to the food that we're talking about, the eating and the drinking that we use for the physical body and for the nafs. You'll forgive me, but this is just my opinion based on conversations with my teachers over many years that I'm sharing with you, that the food of the ruh is the Quran. The ruh is from Allah and the Quran is from Allah. Of course, everything we've just mentioned, food and drink and everything in creation is from Allah. But the Quran is the direct speech of Allah. It is not created. It is not created. We must remember that. It is the direct uttered speech of Allah. So, as we are restraining, as we are refraining, as we are patiently abstaining and refraining our physical side, our physical needs and desires with the fasting, we have the ability to let free and to let the ruh suddenly now be fed in a way that normally it isn't being fed. Excessive eating, excessive drinking, excessive engagement even in physical relations to an excessive nature can sometimes make the nafs become greedy. The opposite, which is fasting, allows the ruh then to be fed from its source, which is we engage in our recitation, in our reflection, in our pondering of the Quran. So I bring that to our attention because that also helps our character build. As we are being patient from the physical, it allows our souls to expand by reading, reflecting, reciting the Quran. And of course, we remind ourselves that the Quran itself, this is what we need in our daily lives. It begins, subhanAllah, what do we see on page 1 when we read Surah Fatiha? We read every single day in every rak'ah of every salah that we made, we ask Allah for guidance. Ihdina as-sirat al-mustaqim. Guide us to the straight path. We ask Allah to guide us to the straight path. And that's when you open the Mus'haf, you find this on page 1, written in Surah Fatiha. Allah mentions this on page 1 and mentions we have to do this every single rak'ah of our salah. We ask Allah for guidance. What do we read if we open the Mus'haf at the top of page 2? Alif Lam Mim. ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. Subhanallah. Alif Lam Mim. Verily, this is the book of God. This is the book in which there is no doubt. A guidance for the muttaqeen, for the people of taqwa, for the people who have mindfulness, consciousness, awareness of Allah. Subhanallah. Isn't that amazing? That the thing that we're asking for on page 1 when we read it, guides us to the straight path. And the thing we ask for in every rak'ah of our salah, Allah is telling us in the beginning of Surah Baqarah that this book, this Quran, is our book of guidance, if we are people of taqwa. So, in this month of Ramadan, the month of the Quran, this book of guidance will be accessed by us more than probably any other time of the year. And in doing so, we are feeding the soul and guiding ourselves to be able to know the direction of our lives, the straight path that we need to follow in our lives. So, as we are trying to build our patience through the restraint and the abstention, we remind ourselves of the benefit that the ruh can be fed from the Quran in a way that perhaps it doesn't get done so throughout the rest of the year. I mentioned that I wanted to talk about a second element of character building during the month of Ramadan. And I wonder if maybe this year, if we are still in a state of lockdown, that this might be even more important perhaps in our lives than we've ever experienced before. That character trait that we need to develop and I'd say this is fundamental in our time of our history to develop as much as we possibly can, is unity and brotherhood. Unity and brotherhood. There may well be people now rolling their eyes saying, oh, unity and brotherhood. It's fundamental to our deen. We know that Allah says in the Quran, roughly translated, verily the believers are ikhwa, brothers and sisters. We have this brotherhood, we have this akhuwa between us. We need to build that sense of unity. We need to build that sense of brotherhood. This is part of our good character, to have unity and brotherhood. We know that, subhanAllah, none of us truly believes until we love for our brother what we love for ourselves. That's brotherhood. That's akhuwa. To love for your brother what you love for yourself. How many of us actually focus on how important that is, that we develop that unity and brotherhood? What's the connection with fasting? Subhanallah. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said in a hadith found in At-Tirmidhi, roughly translated, fast when they fast, and break your fast when they break their fast, and sacrifice on the day when they sacrifice. Imam At-Tirmidhi said in commenting on this hadith that many of the people of knowledge explain this hadith by saying the meaning is to fast and to break the fast and to sacrifice with the jama'ah, or with the majority of the people. This is important, brothers and sisters, that we recognize we are a community, we are an ummah. We are used to doing things in Ramadan with the jama'ah. We go to the Taraweeh, we often will break the fast together, and many people will have the suhoor together. Maybe this year that won't be possible. Allahu A'lam. We don't know yet. But if it is not possible, it means we need to focus on akhuwa even more, because we may not be in the physical environments that we're used to, where we would normally build these bonds of akhuwa. Which means we need to work maybe just a little bit harder by either using virtual platforms like this one that you are now sharing with me as we speak. So either virtual platforms, telephones, however it may be, we need to make sure that we're not ignoring, we're not neglecting this element of character, which is the building of akhuwa. And if I might, on this element of akhuwa, just for a moment, I said earlier when we talked about patience, I said about how potentially many of us, we normally eat and drink excessively because it's a pleasure, not just a need. I would argue, and I speak for myself, maybe many of you are not in this situation, but I would argue for myself, there are very few times in my life that I can say that I'm truly hungry. If we've had a hard day in work and we come back to the house, and we say, oh, I'm so hungry. Very often we mean that the stomach is empty. We don't mean hungry. There are two differences. Hunger doesn't just mean that the stomach is empty. It means you've digested what's already in it. So if you had breakfast this morning and by lunchtime your stomach is empty, we feel that that's hunger. That's not actual hunger, because you can still survive many, many hours, if not days, without any more food. But we feel the hunger because our stomachs are empty. As I say, there are very few times in our lives where we feel true hunger. If you're fasting a long fast, particularly, as I say, in the long summer days and even more so in the Northern Hemisphere, by the end of that fast, we may well have felt hunger. 17 and a half, 18 and a half hours of fasting. If you go even further north, we are here in the UK, but if you go even further north, up to 20, 21 hours, so some countries are even fasting in Ramadan. By the end of that fast, you could well have felt actual hunger. But subhanAllah, Allah has blessed us so much. That most often we know, and I'm going to bold and italic and underline the word know, that inshallah there will be a meal, an iftar, at the end of that day. Sometimes we may wonder, what will that meal be? Sometimes we may wonder, what shall we have for that iftar. Sometimes we may wonder, what shall we feed ourselves and feed our children? Sometimes we may wonder, what are we feeding our children because they're fussy, and we have to have a variety of things to satisfy their appetites. So we often may wonder what may come, what food is coming, what shall I cook, what do I feed the kids? I wonder how many of us, particularly living in many of the countries that may be watching this right now, I wonder how many of us have ever genuinely worried or concerned ourselves or thought to ourselves if we will feed our children, or if we will feed ourselves. Remember I said a couple of moments ago, we will often wonder what shall I cook, what shall I eat, what shall I feed the kids, what will be on the menu for iftar, how many dishes are there going to be, what is the masjid serving, what is the local buffet serving, all of these whats. But there are millions of our brothers and sisters today, as they will be in Ramadan, wondering if they will feed their children. Not what, if. Wondering if they will be able to feed themselves. Wondering if they can feed their elderly. Wondering if there will be a food pack from an aid agency coming over the next couple of days to feed them. We don't need to go through the list, but all of us are aware immediately of the situation in Syria, of the situation in Rohingya camps, of the situation in Kashmir, of the situation in Palestine, and the situation in Yemen. And these are just five. Five of the countries in which millions, genuinely brothers and sisters, millions of our brothers and sisters, members of our ummah, our brothers and sisters, will wonder if there will be food to give their children. There will be many brothers and sisters wondering if there will be a date for the iftar at the end of the fast. And subhanAllah, many of them are still fasting. Many of them are still fasting. These are things that we don't need to worry about. So I would argue, in terms of building our sense of akhuwah, of our brotherhood, maybe when we feel those pangs of hunger towards the end of a fast in the summer months in the Northern Hemisphere, maybe that's the moment, the only moments, we might momentarily appreciate what millions of our brothers and sisters are having to feel every single day of the year, not just in Ramadan. Many of them will be feeling this today, tomorrow, the day after. Many of them will be feeling them at all kinds of times and places. Many of them will be feeling this regularly, wondering what will happen. Many of them will be actually starving to death. Many of our brothers and sisters will starve over the next few months in famine-ridden places around the world. So maybe as we approach our fasting this year, we become more appreciative of the situation our brothers and sisters find themselves in many, many places around the world. And we try whatever we can do from our akhuwah, from our brotherhood that we're trying to build in our characters, to do whatever we can to help. But not only do we do whatever we can to help, and for many of us that may be awareness raising, it may be donations, it may be relief work, whatever it might be. Everybody knows their capacity. But we should try to do something as a minimum. We should be remembering our brothers and sisters in our du'as. Minimum. But on top of that, when we have that recognition, and maybe try it for the first few days of Ramadan, consciously think, set a reminder if we need to in our phone, that for that couple of hours when we're actually hungry before the iftar, this is the situation of our brothers and sisters, millions of them, every day of the week, of the month, of the year, around the world, in many, many places. And it reminds us that we need to try to do whatever we can to help their situation. The second thing I hope, which is part of good character as well, it will make us do shukr. It will make us do shukr for what we have been given. It will make us be grateful, be thankful for what Allah has given. Remind ourselves, Allah gives to whom He chooses and withholds from whom He chooses. It is Allah's choice that He has given us, alhamdulillah, thumma alhamdulillah, abundance of food and drink. of security, of wealth, of all of these things that we find ourselves comfortably enjoying, many of us. It is Allah's choice to do so, not anything fantastic that we've done. However much we think, well, I'm a pharmacist, I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer, I'm a whatever, I've earned it. Ar-Razak has chosen to give us what he has chosen to give us. Therefore, his choice, we need to thank him for. How many times have we attended the Jummah khutbah and heard the Imam at the end say, وَاشْكُرُوا لِي وَلَا تَكْفَرُونَ وَاشْكُرُوا لِي وَلَا تَكْفَرُونَ. Be grateful to me, do shukr to me, وَلَا تَكْفَرُونَ, and do not reject faith. وَاشْكُرُوا لِي وَلَا تَكْفَرُونَ. Every Friday we hear our Imams mention this, and it maybe washes us by without thinking. Be grateful to me and do not reject faith. We need to do shukr to Allah for the abundance he has given us. We need to do shukr to Allah for the Islam he has given us. We need to do shukr to Allah for the Iman. We need to do shukr to Allah for everything. We need to do shukr to Allah for everything that he has given for us. In the Quran, Allah has mentioned, roughly translated, that we tested them with ease and we tested them with difficulty in order that they may turn back. We are tested with difficulties and we are tested with ease in order to see which one turns back if we turn back to Allah. I would argue that it's sometimes easier to turn back to Allah when you're tested with difficulty. Because at times of difficulty, every one of us automatically raises our hands and says, Ya Rabbi, with tears in our eyes. Because we need that help. We need that help. And in terms of help, when we began our talk today, we talked about patience. We need help. So we raise our hands and we call out to Allah and we say, Ya Rabbi, and we remind ourselves that Allah says in Surah Baqarah, Ya ayyuhalladhina asta'inu bis-sabri was-salah, Inna Allah ma'a sabirin. Oh, you who believe, seek help. We need help. We raise our hands, Ya Rabbi. Seek help where? Bis-sabri was-salah. In patience and prayer. So when we go back to thinking about how we develop patience, patience is also a route to help from Allah. So when we're in difficulty, we know we raise our hands, we make dua, we turn back to Allah, we seek his help. But this ayah mentions we tested them with ease. Hardship and ease. When we're tested with ease, how many of us recognize ease is a test? Why? Because when the going's good, when things are plain sailing, when everything's looking fine, do we then turn back to Allah in shukr? This is fundamental, brothers and sisters. We need to recognize we have to thank Allah for all that he's given us, given to us. وَاشْكُرُوا لِي وَلَا تَكْفَرُونَ. Be grateful to me and do not reject faith. We need to do shukr to Allah. Amazing things. We could dedicate an entire subject matter, and maybe we will in the weeks to come, to this subject of shukr. So I won't dwell on it too much right now. But I just want us to understand that in our sense of feeling ukhuwah, in our sense of unity, in our sense of how we recognize our ummah and their situation, we also have to also recognize our situation and be grateful for what we have and make dua and take action for what our brothers and sisters' situations Allah has put them in. So I hope today we may go away from this now thinking about how our fasting in Ramadan can contribute to two of those character elements that I said we need to build, which is Sabr and of course ukhuwah, brotherhood. It may be that in a subsequent episode, if Allah gives us an opportunity and tawfiq, that we will maybe hone in and focus on shukr as part of our character as well, because it is so important that we think about it. But for today, I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keeps us all safe, safe in terms of our health, safe in terms of our security, and most importantly, safe in terms of our iman. Jazakum Allahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.